In this slide set, I asked you to look at a couple of slides before we move on to the presentation that I did for you today on the video lecture. So you've already seen Anne Gentile in a video that probably is a very recent video. Today we're going to begin to focus on the work that Anne Gentile created over a period of 40 plus years. She was one of the great thinkers of our time, and our work will continue to focus on her contributions over the next couple of weeks. So I've asked you to look at this slide, and generally what I want you to do is notice the hierarchical nature of this slide. Notice how you have types of movements, and then you also have within that different types of movements. We're calling those movements orienting movement, adaptive movement, excuse me, and non-adaptive movement. Orienting movement provides information that's effective for coordinated adaptive movement. In other words, we pick up information from the environment by orienting ourselves to it, and then we create adaptations to that environment through our movement behavior. I want you to notice how I've divided adaptive movement into a series of definitions here. Notice that adaptive movement is movement that is made to change or maintain the position of an object. It's movement that is made to maintain the position of the body, or any combination of these two things. Later on, we're going to use these definitions, and I'll come back to defining them so that you can understand how they're used in the taxonomy. And then I asked you to look at the eye tracking video that's by SMI, and essentially SMI is a company, and in that video they're trying to sell you SMI products. Well, in our motor behavior lab we actually have portable SMI goggles. So we are able to do eye tracking and measure how sighted individuals pick up information through their vision. So essentially, I asked you a few questions to think about while you were looking at the video. And I've asked you to tell me what some of the eye tracking measures are. So some of the things that you measure in eye tracking are how a person fixates, sets his or her eyes on particular objects, how long their eyes fixate on a particular object, and then also maps, how does the eye move, what's the breadth or the boundaries to which the eye moves to pick up this information. Probably if you looked at novices, you would find more narrow boundaries, but less fixations. Whereas for experts, they would pick up information from a larger set of information because they have larger capacity to fit it into. But they fixate longer than the novice does. So they have more breadth, but they fixate longer. So think about examples that you might give of how eye tracking would be a useful tool or measure in kinesiology research. So here's a couple of examples that I thought of. In sport management, you might look at, for a marketing question, how a person looks at a shelf of food products or sport products, and which products sell better on particular shelves? Do you just put whatever fits on the middle shelf, or do you put an object that might not sell as well on the middle shelf because things on the middle shelf tend to sell better? Or in sport, where do athletes fixate to pick up information, and how are those fixations, the places, the length of them, different from how novices or non-athletes fixate on these kinds of contexts? What type of movements do these athletes and non-athletes make? These are the kinds of questions we would ask in motor learning. So on this slide, I'm now going to define for you the types of movement behavior. The first one we talked about is orienting movements, and eye tracking would be a great way of looking at the orienting of an individual based upon vision. So you can see that orienting movement is movement that's made to adjust any of the sensory apparatus. It could be the ears, it could be the mouth, it could be to touch something, to feel something better, the wind or something like that. Anything that orients a sensory apparatus would be called an orienting movement. An adaptive movement would be a movement that's made to either maintain or change the position of the body, or a movement that's made to maintain or change the position of an object. Right now, I'm sitting in a seat and I'm not touching anything. I'm not touching the keyboard. I'm not touching the keypad. And so I'm involved in an adaptive movement to maintain my body position, but with no limb transport manipulation, no manipulation with my limbs. We'll come back to the language limb transport manipulation again, which means the manipulation of objects with your limbs. Manipulation of objects doesn't have to happen with your limbs. An example would be soccer. You hit the ball with your head. It's still manipulation of an external object, but it's not with your limbs. So limb transport manipulation includes any manipulation of objects. It doesn't have to be with your limbs. But right now, I don't have any LTM. If I got up and I walked around the room and I picked up the keypad and I started to manipulate it, then I would be involved in an adaptive movement where I'm changing the position of my body and I'm manipulating an external object. So you could see how that particular skill changes, even though I'm basically doing or trying to achieve the same outcome. I actually am still doing the same thing. Or the movement is different, actually. And non-adaptive movements are reflexive movements. Reflexive movements are different than adaptive movements in that they are not goal-directed, and in fact, they are not consciously controlled. So when we looked at that information processing model very shortly in one of our last presentations, and you'll see again in this presentation, in fact, what you see is no information processing in reflexive movements. Rather, what happens is the impulse goes from the external or the sensory organ to the spinal cord, and the reflexive movement is that you have immediate output. Imagine if the impulse has to go up to the brain, then you have a longer period of time to process the movement through that information processing system, and then output can occur. So here you see this great picture of volleyball. You see the spiker here and the blockers, and you also see people on the offensive team who are getting ready to get the ball, possibly as a reflection off of the blockers. So I want you to look at this volleyball picture, and I would like for you to describe both the spiker's movement and the blocker's movement according to the diagram to the right. So what I've done is I've extracted out just the adaptive movement part of the model. It's exactly what you saw on earlier slides. Movement made to change the position of the body, movement made to change the position of an object or the combinations of those. You see those same definitions right here. So I'm asking, what are the movements, or how would you describe those movements of the spiker and the blockers according to this diagram? Take a moment. I think it's adaptive movement. It's movement of the body because the spiker is going from the floor to a jumped position, so he's changing the position of his body, not necessarily his arm swing in this condition, but certainly the positioning where the body is in space. And if we can carry it through just a little bit, he's going to change the position of the object. Let's make believe that all three of these people actually hit the ball. And so they are changing the position of an object as well. You could see the same thing for the blockers. The receivers, on the other hand, or these defenders over here, earlier I called them offenders, but actually they are the defenders. The defender basically will probably maintain his position because he can make some prediction about where the ball might rebound to off of the blocker's hands, and then he would be able to defend against that rebound. The second question I ask is, can you describe why officials or referees in sport must develop good orienting movement skills? Think about orienting movements, movements that are made to adjust the sensory apparatus. So you're picking up information better through your eyes or your ears. Well, think about volleyball as the example. You have a referee that's above the net. You have an umpire that's under the net on the other side. The referee is responsible for violations that occur above the net. The umpire is responsible for violations that occur under the net. So the point is, if either one, the referee or the umpire, has their eyes oriented in the wrong place, that is, if the referee is looking at the floor, then in fact he hasn't made the call that he's supposed to call as a volleyball referee. So here's that information processing model that I was talking about earlier. Again, I want you to notice there's input. Now I've added, you can have input from internal and external stimuli. You can have central processing, perception, decision, and effector. And then you could also have movement process and movement product. Internal and external stimuli could be or internal stimuli could be proprioception, getting information in response to what your recent movement process and product were. You get information back into the system. that serves as internal stimuli. You also get external stimuli. Any kind of emergency sound, you would respond to that stimulus. Also, a ball being hit by a bat in baseball would be a stimulus you're going to respond to as an infielder in baseball. Or the snap count for the placeholder would be a good example of input in football. So one of the other last things that I wanted to say about orienting movements is that our cats and our dogs are actually great at orienting movements. Think about your cat or your dog, how they automatically open their ear, turn their ear. They hardly even move their head. They just turn the ear to open it up to be able to receive information better because they want to know what's going on in the environment. Movement process would be two different pieces. Movement process, or actually three different pieces. The movement process actually includes information processing. So this is a process, and it's part of the motor processing. In this process, we actually create what's called the motor plan. In the decision process, the motor plan is created and it helps the performer in terms of guiding what he or she intends to do in response to these stimuli in the environment. The motor program is a different part of information processing. It's developed in the effector process, and it guides movement and gives us information so that we could guide the neuromuscular process or the motor program, or the motor program is the set of commands that guides the movement process. Notice that the form of movement can also be described as part of the movement process. Now, what do I actually mean when I say the part of the movement process? That's the form of movement. That's the observable part of movement. It's what we see when people perform movement behavior. So we could measure the movement process, the form of movement, as the movement process, and we can measure it like biomechanics or biomechanists measure the movement process. That would be the study of the movement pattern. Biomechanists would look at the actual form and the actual parameters that are attached to that form. And then finally, the definition I want you to have going into the future is, what is the movement product? The product is related to the outcome or the achievement of the goal. What is the goal of the movement? In basketball, the goal of the movement is to get the ball to your teammate, to get the ball in the basket. The product would be making 2 points, getting the ball in the basket, getting the ball to my teammate so that he or she could get the ball into the basket as a layup. So the final slide that I have for today is to define what a taxonomy is. A taxonomy is nothing but a system that we use for classifying things. So I might have a taxonomy for how I organize things on my discs In fact, I do. I have a disk where I have all my classes, and each class is separated, and it's separated into the handouts that I have for that class. It's separated into the slides. Now I'm adding videos to those files. So you could see how that would be a taxonomy that I have for classifying my disks. Gentile used a taxonomy to classify motor skills. And she classified those based upon the movement of the body, the adaptive movement. Is the body moving? Is the body stable? And also whether the body was manipulating an external object. So was there an external object involved, and was the performer interacting with that external object? And finally, the constraints of the environment. In other words, is the environment changing, or is the environment more predictable? So these are the things that we're going to be getting into on Thursday, and I need for you to have a very good understanding of all of these slides as we move into our lecture.